My name is Angie Guatemala.
My name is Orexa Nahme.
I'm Chinde, and today we're going to be covering our topic, which is about international racism and Orientalism.
And we're going to focus on the Syrian refugee crisis.
And we're going to relate the Syrian refugee crisis to issues with environmental racism and also environmental issues as political issues.
Orientalism is a byproduct of colonialism in its attempts to impose its own standards and cultures upon the rest of the world. In simpler terms, Orientalism basically is about how the Western world applies its own culture to compare it to that of the non-Western world, which then portrays them as an other, someone who's different and doesn't fit the standards or norms that is socially accepted. Because of this misconception or misrepresentation, the Orient is often portrayed as exotic, backwards, or uncivilized, when in fact they have their own culture and history. Edward Said theorized that there is an existing relationship between culture and power, particularly during the colonial period. Therefore, the representation of the non-Western world was heavily influenced by politics and power relations to portray the Islamic and Oriental area as backward countries that are uncivilized due to the lack of advanced technology and institutions as seen in the West. This led to a subjective depiction of the Orient to be seen as the complete opposite of the modernity of the West. Orientalism isn't a relatively new concept. It's existed a while back and still existing today as well. Now the question is, who are the people that perpetuate Orientalism? Well, back in the day it would be the colonial powers and the Western countries, and I guess as of recently in today's society it would be the developed countries that continue this cycle. But those developed countries are also the Western countries, so I guess there's not really much of a difference, because colonialism is still prevalent in today's society, which then contributes to the continuation of this skewed representation of the Orient. So those in power, such as the politicians, would then portray the Orient, particularly Muslim people, as being extremist, violent, and radical terrorists to support their political agenda. But then this, as you can guess, leads to very discriminatory practices and a plethora of issues and complications. International racism is prevalent in the Syrian refugee crisis. So because of the manner in which Western countries have constructed the Orient's identity, individuals from the Middle East are being generalized into one homogeneous group of Muslims who are deemed as potential national security threats because they've come to represent terrorism and oppressing women, which are considered dangerous to American and Western views. So even though many people are dying and being displaced, a lot of countries are reluctant about opening up their borders to accept these refugees simply because of the ideas of Orientalism and what they embody for the Middle East and the Orient.
Our argument and position and analysis of the problem with international racism and also Orientalism is recognizing that there are power relations and also issues with identity. So there has always been a divide between those in power and those resisting. This semester we touched on power relations and identity. Identity can allow you to have the upper hand in a system of control, or identity could disenfranchise you. Racism is not a natural state of mind. It is something that we perpetuate, something that we teach, and continue to let happen. This is overt racism, but we also forget that there's systems of power that are systematically perpetuating oppressive power relations, especially for people of color. So in relation to identity and power relations, or others, assumption of truth, mobilization, emotions, and how it is relevant to global citizenship. We wanted to touch on, even in academia, we have seen the continuation of discriminatory practices through writing and portrayal of people of color. That people are exerting power over another and they often come from scholarly work on certain groups of people. This is what Edward Said mentioned about Orientalism. Historians, anthropologists, and other social scientists have written about non-Western cultures and created an understanding on these cultures based on their own biases. This has created an even bigger gap between us and them, leading us to be not understanding and less empathetic towards those who are different from us. Orientalism has allowed international racism to thrive because A, we associate Islam with brown and black folks, which only reinstates racism and also Islamophobia and xenophobia in the global north. Even with the natural disasters or war-torn countries, we, as developed nations, tend to look the other way when we need to help them. But if they had that problem in more Western countries or the global north, then we would be more inclined to help them. So that's the other thing about international racism, is knowing when to intervene or deciding who gets help and who doesn't get help, depending on how it affects the person who's helping or the country who's helping. When we become allies, or when we decide to become allies on an individual level, they step up to speak but don't take a step back to allow historically marginalized people to speak for themselves. That is the issue at hand with Orientalism as well. Scholars from the international, specifically from those countries we are racist towards, are not as valid or perhaps don't have the chance to write about their own cultures. So the first step in making the world a better place, as we say, is recognizing how our own identities, whether that be your socioeconomic status, the lighter shade of your skin, or citizenship, and seeing how your positionality can be oppressing to others. How are your own power relations perpetuating hate and misunderstanding? Power relations and identity can also address recognizing that. For example, someone like me, who lives in a developed country with more technology, consumption, and we also produce more CO2 emissions. So I live in a place that has more access to solutions for environmental changes. However, that also depends on perhaps the color of my skin and my economic status. Environmental racism happens just as much in the US as it does in the world. More people of color are exposed to pollution and toxic waste than anyone else. What about the rest of the world? Droughts are naturally occurring, but often are enhanced through climate change. So when we see places like Syria where there are people of color and the practices of Islam, we are less inclined to help them and perpetuate even more hate through Orientalism, through assuming that Islam is a really violent religion. And then we forget that climate change and droughts can also affect the way that a country behaves or a group of people behaves. If you don't have water, if you don't have food, and you don't have crops or any sort of sustenance for your people or your country, then what are you going to do? Normally, for people, they resort to, any desperate means to survive. So there's a lot of conflict, but we don't want to help them because they're people of color and they're also practicing Islam. Not everybody, but a lot. And so we wondered what would happen if that had happened in a Western country or a country of the global north where there are people who maybe are white, Anglo-European looking, and good Christians.
In order to end the Syrian refugee crisis, we need to unite as a world and find a better solution. Here are some solutions powerful nations like the EU and the United States can do to help. First, we need to prioritize saving lives. That means opening up safe routes to sanctuary, making sure they have a safe and legal routes instead of overcrowded boats. We need to offer them a safe place to stay. That means guaranteeing resettlement. We also need to offer them what the Amnesty International calls humanitarian visas for people without proper documentations. We need to investigate human trafficking. We need to investigate smugglers that are taking money from refugees. They're taking money that the refugees have been saving for their whole life. We need to provide asylum. Between 2007 and 2014, the EU has spent over $2 billion on fences, security technology, and border patrols. Instead of using this money to donate to NGOs and the UN. The UN and other NGOs are not well prepared to take asylums, leading to overcrowded refugee camps and undersupplied refugee camps. We need international donors to provide financial support to frontline states like Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. As frontline states, they bear a burden to take care of the refugees. They're taking care of 95% of the refugees. Lebanon alone hosts more refugees than the whole of Europe. This leads to maintaining an open door policy. Every nation in the world needs to maintain an open door policy. Lebanon takes 1,200,000 refugees in 2016. Turkey took 1,900,000 refugees. Egypt took 130,000 refugees. Jordan took 650,000 refugees. Iraq took 250,000 refugees. Meanwhile, the Arab states in the Persian Gulf have taken 0 refugees. This shows how different powerful countries need to come together in order to provide access to the refugees. Also, as individuals, we need to contribute. We can contribute by creating a mixed culture by integrating them into our society. We need to share their stories and make sure everybody knows what's going on and see what they can do to help. We need to pressure world leaders to provide emergency funding. We need to volunteer with NGOs, example, International Rescue Committee. Even the little things can help, like donations to the refugees. We can donate clothes, shoes, sanitary supplies, food, and also we can donate some money to the White Helmets. The White Helmets are Syrian civil defense. They're civilians from Syria that step up to volunteer to save Syrians that are in danger and in need. By donating some money, we can help them train them better.
So even though opening up borders is considered ideal and beneficial for the Syrian refugees, critics against it would argue that it increases the population in already overpopulated countries, because most of these countries are closing its doors per se, are the developed countries. Take America, for example. It is currently going through an internal conflict regarding the much debated issue of undocumented immigrants. And although I don't support this view, taking in these Syrian refugees could be a little problematic for the country. So essentially, more resources need to be allocated to the inductive efforts taken in to check the refugees and make sure they're not hostile, simply because of what Orientalism has done to the depiction of the Middle East. So there would have to be increased security checks, and more resources will also be needed to provide temporary food and shelter for the refugees as well. So even though it's an idealized solution to help others, it could potentially be a setback, maybe economically, for the countries involved, because taking in refugees also does not guarantee a quick and easy transition. It takes a while for them to assimilate as well.
So essentially, the people who are being left out and excluded are the individuals still currently living in Syria or the war zones. That is to say, it is the people who are fighting, because the war is still ongoing. It hasn't ended yet. So rather than fixing the root of the problem, this solution is basically just putting a band-aid over a leak. It's going to, yes, help the refugees, but there's still going to be many, many more.
So this leads us to the question, who is being prioritized to solve the problem? In the context of Syria, it can be concluded that countries prioritized to solve the problem are the neighboring countries of Lebanon, Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. They're taking 95% of Syrian refugees and left with little to no resource to provide to the refugees.